And I'm going to share screen. Let's share that one right there, actually. There we go, perfect. So let's hide this. And we're gonna do this here. Let me see here. Full screen, there we go. Okay, perfect. We can start. So hello, everybody. Majority of you don't know who I am, so I'm going to do a little preamble of who I am, and we'll do a little more of a preamble about tonight's presentation, and then we're going to get into it. First of all, thank you so much for spending some time with me tonight. This is a special presentation, part of a series of presentations I've been doing over the past several months, all connected to British folklore and mythology. Now, at times I'm going to stop because I have a very large cup of tea here and it needs to be drunk, so bear with me. Let's start by, first of all, introducing myself. So my name is Ben Stimpson. I am a counsellor in Kitchener, Ontario, Canada, but by the accent, you can probably guess that I'm not from Canada originally. I'm originally from Britain. I was born in St Asaph in North Wales, Flintshire, or what was then called Clwyd, and I emigrated to Canada as a child. I studied, originally my background is social work, but I studied spiritual psychotherapy, and I have been practicing as a counsellor now for almost 2 years, coming up to 2 years. So what is a counsellor doing talking about folklore? Folklore is something that I really love. It is something that I have really gravitated towards in my personal, private, spiritual life, and also now in my professional life. Folklore is chock full of archetypes. It is a huge indicator of culture, and it is an encapsulation of not only a culture's values, but also trickling down to the individual. It is the access point that individuals enter into and is in many ways initiated into the group that they become part of. So I started to put this British folklore and mythology series together, in part because I wanted to explore deeper and share what I've learned around my culture's folklore and mythology, but also because as I started moving more in a professional direction towards using archetypes and motifs, I started to see the way that folklore is both a communal as well as an individual component. So as I said, I do use folklore a lot to inform my practice with clients, but it's also just really, really fun. I'd like to do a shout out first to some Facebook groups that have graciously allowed me to advertise this special presentation on. One, and I think probably most of you come from one of these two Facebook groups, but if you come from somewhere else, welcome. First of all, I'd like to thank the British Medieval History Facebook group. It's an amazing Facebook group. I've been a member on it for many, many years now, and it's close to 150,000 individuals. It's a Facebook group devoted to mostly British, but also more broadly European. There is another Facebook group connected to European medieval history, and it's amazing. Some of the discussions on there is incredible, and there's new content every day. Some very, very wise individuals on there. And so go join it if you're interested, and if you are part of it, welcome to our medievalists. The second group I want to thank is the Folklore Researchers Group, which is a Facebook group specifically for individuals who are interested in researching folklore from an anthropological bent. So this is it's about 5,000 members, I think, last count, 3,000 members, and they come from the anthropological sciences. They come from various different disciplines, all to come together to share their knowledge and their wisdom around mostly British folklore. There's a lot of British folklore on there, but there's members from all over the world that share aspects of their own culture's folklore. So if you're interested in deepening your understanding or asking questions about how folklore intersects with other humanities, that is a great folklore group to join. And also, finally, I would like to thank the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids. One of the groups that I belong to in my own spiritual life is OBOD, Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids. And I'd like to thank their members' Facebook group for allowing me to advertise this on there too. That is much better. I have found that story and working with characters from folklore, especially folklore which is grounded in my own, in the landscape that I come from, has been very profound for my own spiritual leanings. And so I'd like to give a shout out to them as well. And many of the other groups that I have advertised on, the admins have been very, very supportive of my endeavor here. So that's a little bit about who I am and where I come from. So Christmas. Oh, we've still got a couple of people coming in here. So for those new people who are coming in, you can get caught up. I'm going to be posting this on my YouTube channel later on. But I was just giving a little background about who I am and why we're here. So British folklore and mythology, huge subject. Today we are going to speak specifically around Christmas and some of the New Year's traditions. As some of my students who have taken many of the other presentations are in this course, as I've said to them multiple times, the most important thing to understand about folklore and mythology is that they're not just stories. They're not just little things that we tell children to get them to bed. Certainly they are used that way, but in much more broader focus, folklore and mythology are part of culture. And we all belong to a culture. We belong to a culture of our neighborhood. We belong to a culture of our family. And those then become combined with local, regional cultures, all the way to the national, and then eventually the international. So when it comes to anything in our life, there is always usually culture around it. And every aspect has a purpose. Every aspect has a certain niche that it encapsulates. And folklore in particular, as I've talked in other presentations, folklore is all of those cultural elements that do not fit with the kind of national culture. They are ways that smaller groups and regions and even smaller locations kind of take up ideas, concepts, traditions, belief systems, what have you, and make them regional, make them local, make them own them, right? So for development of folklore, and we'll see many examples of how this process works, folklore is an organic process. It isn't superstition, although superstition sometimes comes into it. It is a lens that human groups use and utilize in order to kind of make something understandable to them specifically. So as we go through this, you'll see different regions having different, taking up the stories of Christmas, and the meaning of Christmas, the meaning of New Year's, but changing it or adding to it so that it becomes a very specifically localized phenomenon. We'll see how, for example, caroling is taken up in different communities, and I have two very specific examples of that, so that it not only fits that group, but also becomes an expression of that group. It is a relationship. Folklore and mythology as stories, as culture, is a relationship between the individuals and the group that they belong with, and then a relationship between that group and whatever else they find themselves in, whether or not that is a bigger countrywide identity, or if it's a religious tradition. It's all about relationship. So without further ado, I'm hoping that this will lead us till 9 p.m. Eastern, but as some of my students already know, I tend to become very enthusiastic about this. We may go a little bit over, in which case, if anybody here does need to leave, by all means, check out the YouTube page later on. I'll be posting them on my Facebook page, facebook.com Paduka Wellness, or my YouTube channel. And you can catch up on what you missed. So if you do need to go, I hope you enjoy today's presentation, whether or not you're with us live, or if you catch up on the YouTube page. So let's talk about Christmas. Today we're going to be focusing and breaking this down into 4 major areas. We're going to be talking about the origins of Christmas, where we'll be talking about some of the pre-Christian holidays and traditions that kind of merged with when Christianity was formed, merged with those new emerging traditions. We're going to talk then about Christmas through the ages. We're going to focus on how the Anglo-Saxons took up this idea when they were converted. We're going to talk about the high medieval. We're going to talk about the early modern, and that is the reign of the Stuarts and Hanoverians. And then we're going to talk about that massive, massive culture that really dictated how our Christmases are right now, the Victorian age. But we're also going to kind of deconstruct that as well. There's a lot of myths flying around that the Victorians invented our Christmas, and that is only partially true. We're going to talk in area 3 about some of the spirits of Christmas and the winter in general. We're going to talk about some of the folkloric individuals, such as Father Christmas, the American Santa Claus. We're going to talk about Jack Frost. We're going to talk about the Scottish Cailleach, which is the old hag of winter in the Highlands, and a couple of the other spirits. And then in number 4, we're going to try and take a different bent, and we're going to look specifically at some of the modern traditions that we follow now, and kind of where they came from, and how they've changed over time. We'll talk about some of them in some of the other sections earlier than that, but then we're really going to focus on that. Now, I'll be honest with you, this is such a huge, massive topic. British folklore is not something that you can like talk about in just 2 hours. There's a massive amount of material here. There are so many different cultures that have existed and exist right now in the United Kingdom and Ireland. But we're going to try and just do a brief overview. And if you're interested in continuing this journey, I will post a load of resources on the YouTube page and on my Facebook page, so that you can continue that journey. For the purposes of today, we're not going to talk about Ireland. The other parts of this series, I do look at Irish traditions as well, but Ireland in itself is such again, it's such a massive culture in and of itself, and it has some very specific and unique traditions. So we're going to focus mostly on what I know personally, because it's my own lived experience. We're going to talk about the Welsh, we're going to talk about the English, and we're going to bring in some of the Scottish traditions. So if you were looking forward to Irish traditions, I apologize, but I want to do it justice, and I want to do the rest of the islands justice as well. So without further ado, I'm going to take another swig of tea here. I hope everybody else is having some sort of hot drink tonight. It's quite a cool evening out there, so I don't want you to get cold. And it seems festive, right? Let's dive right in. Oh, and before I move on, I'd like to thank my friend Jackie for assisting me tonight. Quite impromptu. I appreciate you taking on that role. Jackie will be looking at the chat, and if you have any questions, put it in the chat. I unfortunately can't see it, but Jackie will be able to see, and I give her license to just, oh, there we go, to throw that out. So if you have any questions, put them in the chat, and Jackie will be blurting that out for me. But I also ask, if you do have questions, just kind of wait and see if it gets answered later on, and if not, we can also answer some questions at the end. So let's look at the origins of Christmas. So we know from a Christian standpoint, the origins of Christmas are, of course, the birth of Christ 2,050 years ago right now, around there. So we know that Christ was born, and in the Christian tradition, he was believed to be God coming down into the flesh. So but of course, you know, being in Britain and coming from a British background, Christ didn't exist in Britain up until a few centuries later. First was the Romans who Christianized the Celtic people living in England, and what would become England, what would become Wales. And then, of course, the Anglo-Saxons came over, who were pagans. They were following Germanic traditions. The Christianity was almost lost in what would become the British Isles, and then there was a reconversion. So for many centuries, this concept of Christmas didn't exist in mainland Britain. But there are many multiple other traditions that kind of merged and kind of flowed into what would eventually become Christmas. This is what the most important thing, I think, for you to understand, is that the concept of Christmas is not, it didn't just all exist 2,000 years ago as it is. It's an evolution, right? I know in the neo-pagan world, there is a common idea that, you know, the Christians stole all of these traditions. And what I want to also show with this is that that didn't happen. What we have here is the influence of multiple different cultures coming together. You have different beloved traditions being reshaped and kind of rejigged so that the tradition can still continue to be part of the culture, but it's understood through a different lens, suddenly this Christian lens. And now we see the same thing happening with the secular, and we'll talk about that later on. So let's talk about some of the origins of Christmas. These are some very specific traditions that existed beforehand. So the first one is, and I'm just gonna, let me just see here if I can hide this. Oh, let me put that down there. There we go. So we have here Saturnalia. So a little history lesson here. So before the Roman Empire became officially Christian, when the Emperor Constantine proclaimed it the religion of the empire, the Romans were a polytheistic tradition, followers of a polytheistic tradition. They had a whole sway of different gods. There was Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, Saturn. A lot of these god names lended themselves to our days of the week in English. And Saturnalia was their ancient midwinter or solstice festival. Of course, December 21st is the winter solstice for the Northern Hemisphere. And this was a festival for the god Saturn. Now, what's interesting about the Roman tradition is it was very similar to modern Hinduism in many ways. In Hinduism, you have festivals almost every weekend, every week, and it was the same for the ancient Roman tradition. So they had almost 200 different festivals. Now, what's interesting is when we look at the Catholic feast calendar, there's as many feast days each there. So, so it's an interesting parallel, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So the Saturnalia, it often fell between December 17th and 23rd. It was, they would exchange gifts in the form of gag gifts or little clay figurines that they would form or made out of beeswax. One of the aspects of Saturnalia was role reversals. So masters would suddenly serve slaves, and slaves would have the ability to kind of lounge around, sit around and enjoy themselves. And this is actually, when you look at multiple different Northern Hemisphere traditions in the latter half of the year, role reversals, social hierarchy positions being switched around was a common feature. Feasting was both a public and a private affair, so you would be expected during this time, or you could expect during this time, to go to multiple different feasts, both with family members and in the public places. Offerings were made at the Temple of Saturn, and even gladiatorial combats were conducted. And there was aspects throughout the period of Saturnalia through Roman history where any of the gladiators that fell and were killed, their bodies would be offered at the Temple of Saturn. Even in Roman days, this was almost seen as human sacrifice. Of course, the Romans were very anti-human sacrifice, but they were very complex people. The very early Christians took up this idea that dead gladiators were offered to Saturn as a form of human sacrifice in their argument against the empire. But that was only a small aspect of this festival. Merrymaking was really the hallmark of it, and we can see over here. This is a fresco from a Roman villa, and you see them lounging around and generally having a great time. And what was important about this festival in particular was that Saturn was seen as the embodiment of agricultural renewal. So what you would have is you would make sure that Saturn felt respected, that Saturn had offerings made to him, usually in the form of vegetation and offerings at the temple, so that then the next year when spring was coming up, Saturn would give his blessings. So already right off the bat, Saturnalia, we already have those themes that we also see in Christian Christmas celebrations, the idea of renewal, that idea of which actually is quite widespread, that idea of the newborn king and making sure that he was well, right? Except in Saturnalia, Saturn was not seen as dying and resurrecting, but there is a tradition that did, and that is the concept of Mithras' birthday. So for those of you who aren't aware, the Roman Empire was filled with all sorts of different mystery cults. It mirrored ancient Greece in this way, and in some ways it also mirrors modern day Hinduism and Indian tradition. So you have this, basically you had this situation where the Roman legions were going down into the Middle East and coming into close contact with the ancient Persian Empire. Sassans, I think they were at that point. And they found this deity, Mithras, who is a pan-Indo-Persian deity. You find a version of him in India, spoken about in the Vedas. You also find him talked about in Persia proper, and also in like the old Babylonian, Sumeria, Mesopotamia area. And Mithras offered in the Roman form of him, because he was taken up. He was localized and turned into a Roman deity, and we see here this fresco here of the Roman version of Mithras. His story is that he came to Earth in order to be a savior figure, and particularly among soldiers, similar to some of the other mystery cults of which Christianity was counted amongst them. And Mithraism had a very similar structure to early Christianity. They had bishops, there was a hierarchy, and of what our sources tell us, there was also this concept of salvation, of baptism, and the thought of Mithras controlling some sort of a better heaven or afterlife paradise than the ancient Romans were going to get through their own official tradition. So rival Christianity shared many of the same early features, and in many ways it's often posited as a very early contender to Christianity. It would have been either Christianity or Mithraism to become a major religion around the Mediterranean. And what was interesting is that Mithras' birthday was on December 25th. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that Christianity took the holiday of Mithras' birthday of being on December 25th, but what's more likely is that because the reality is, and the interesting thing is, when you look at biblical sources and you look at like the early Christian tradition, there was no real understanding about when Christ was actually born. That is a tradition that evolved through the kind of the way that some of the other traditions in the Roman Empire were operating. It evolved in order to be around this time, and then eventually one of the popes, I think his name was Pope Julian, decreed that Christ's birthday would be celebrated on the 25th of November in their old calendar. But you're starting to see some of the common features existing in the context that Christmas began to come out of in this. So you have a savior figure, you have the birth, Mithraism particularly, their major myth and story is that Mithras went into a cave to defeat this bull that was symbolic of evil in the world. And by killing this bull and re-emerging, Mithras was able to save the world from evil. So you're starting to get a sense here that of kind of similarities here. So we have the Roman context, some of the Roman examples, and of course Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire in the 300s. Constantine, of course, had that very famous vision of the Cairo in the sky and saw that as his cue that he needs to convert to Christianity, and the rest of the empire went with it. So when the Romans converted, let's just go back for a second, when the Romans converted and subsequently Britain also converted, and suddenly then you had the ancient Celtic people who were now Romano-Celts celebrating Christianity, as well as their own Celtic traditions. You had this huge group of individuals who were not within the empire and were not Christians, and they were the Germanic peoples and the people from Scandinavia. They become important later on because what happens is, as we know, the Anglo-Saxons come over in the very late 400s, early 500s. There's no exact timeline for that, when, of course, the Roman Empire starts to collapse in the West, and suddenly Britain is without any Roman legions to defend it. You have this migration or invasion, depending on how you see it, and you suddenly had Anglo-Saxons who were parts of the Germanic tribes of the Angles, the Jutes, the Saxons, and some of the others coming in and forming kingdoms. And then at that point, they were still polytheistic pagans. And one of their traditions that they brought with them was Yule. Now, Yule, of course, is a word that we often see connected with Christmas now. It's a word just indigenous to the English language. And it's actually, it was actually a tradition in and of itself that over time just became merged with Christmas. In the pre-Christian tradition, there was this sense that the god Odin, who was the All-Father in Scandinavian tradition, and of course in Germanic, he would have been called Othin, and there was he has many epithets in other forms of Scandinavian tradition, calling him Father of Yule or the Yule One. There's some connection there with the idea of December being Yule. So there's this word in Anglo-Saxon or in Old English, and it was I'm going to butcher it. I apologize, especially for those of you who come from the medieval history Facebook group. If I butcher this, I apologize. There's this word called Geol. I believe that's how you pronounce it, Geol, which just through a little mutation becomes Jul. And in modern Scandinavian languages, the word for December and for the holiday is J-U-L, which of course in Scandinavian languages, J is always pronounced as a Y, so you had Jul. And there's also a derivative, which is interesting. I found this out. In France, there was a period where the Franks, who were ruled by Charlemagne, we'll talk about him later on, took over a big, vast swath of what would become Germany, and they adopted a word into French, which is joli. And from joli, we then get our modern English word jolly. So jolly and Yule actually share, or have been suggested to share, the same roots, even though they're now usually connected differently. But it's interesting then that jolly then appears in multiple forms connected to various spirits and aspects of Christmas, which is Yule. So the ancient pagan Yule, there were sacrifices made, feasts were made from these sacrifices, and the sacrifices that the ancient pagans were making, usually to sometimes to Tiwaz, to Tiwaz, who's the god Tyr, to Odin, and to some of the other gods. And I apologize if you're a vegan or vegetarian, but I have placed an image here showing that. Sacrifice was always an important aspect of these ancient pagan traditions, as well as early Christianity. And when we think about some of the sacrifices that Christians were making, it was more symbolic, very much more symbolic. But in many ways, those traditional foods that we would have eaten around Christmas time were, from an agrarian point of view, a necessity, and we'll talk about that just in a moment. So what eventually happened then is the Anglo-Saxons were converted. At first, there was a concerted effort by the remnants of the Celtic Church, which was a church established by the Romans before the Anglo-Saxons came, that was now operating in Scotland, or what would become Scotland and Ireland, and a little bit in Wales. And then there was the French Catholic Church that was the continuation of the Gaulish Church. And so these two traditions were trying to both convert the Anglo-Saxons. Anglo-Saxons were converted to French Christianity, and that just deepened as they were conquered by William the Conqueror. But we'll talk about medieval in a little bit. And so what happened was Yule and Christmas merged. So then the question, why are there so many celebrations existing in December? Why, what is it about that? So and it's interesting, when you look at both continents, both Europe and Asia, and also North America, you see that at the same times of the year, there are celebrations, there are patterns that emerge about celebrations. So, December is really when winter starts to finally just come upon us. And I mean, looking outside, like, it was beautiful up until about a week ago, and then suddenly we had major snow in southern Ontario. Winter really is really associated with December. But when you think about the kind of the life cycle of peoples who are very similar in lifestyle, you start to see certain patterns emerge. So you have harvest time around the same time of the year. You have, usually after the harvest time, there is a period in multiple traditions and multiple places where that period is devoted to the dead. So, if harvest time is the beginning of October, later in October, early November, you tend to have a celebration of the dead, or somehow connected to the dead. For example, you have, in the Catholic sense, All Souls. In the Mexican sense, especially Chicanos and further south, they're still Northern Hemisphere, mind you. You have, Dia de los Muertos. And in India, the part of the ancestry, I'm saying this carefully here, part of the ancestry or part of the cultural ancestry of Indian traditions come from further north in Persia and further north from there. They're connected to the ancient Greek and the ancient Roman through this proposed language family, the Indo-European language group, which also would have shared cultural traits as well. And so they also have a period of the dead called Pitri Paksha. And all of these traditions of the dead all are connected around the same time of year. So you have harvest time, you have the darkening when the northern hemisphere starts to tilt, the earth starts to tilt back again. You can see that the days are growing shorter. You have this period of the dead, and then just after, in December time, usually you'll start to see various different traditions where it's now time to start to prepare for the winter. So you may have a period of fasting and then a big feast as you start to slaughter the animals that you don't want to continue to live into the new year because they're going to be a mouth to feed and you won't have that food. So it's time to sacrifice those animals. Usually there's a sacrifice to a deity, or just generally living an agrarian lifestyle. You're going to want to have that meat and have that sustenance for the coming winter. So you're going to preserve it, but you can't preserve it all. And so there's a big excuse to have a festival. You're feasting as one large, big gathering before you really hunker down into winter. And so then if you look at it from that kind of anthropological point of view, it begins to make a little bit more sense why some of these traditions happen at the times that they do, because it's lifestyle based and it's also very particular to kind of, where they are located, right? But it also makes sense just from a survival standpoint, right? So that also means this is why you also tend to have similar myths pop up in multiple different cultures, especially around New Year, and why New Year is usually around the same time for different communities in the Northern Hemisphere. You tend to have the story of kind of the return of the sun, the rebirth of the world, the rebirth of the sun god, the rebirth of some sort of pastoral deity again and again and again. And it's because these people, where these myths were coming from, were some of them were connected through ancient cultural linkages, but the majority of it is really just because they're from the same hemisphere. Okay. So that's given us a little bit of the backstory to some of the context to some of of what we're going to talk about soon. Jackie, are there any questions before we head on?
No questions, but someone has asked if you can keep the cursor off to the side of the screen during the presentation.
I am absolutely. I do tend to use the cursor though to illustrate points, so I'm going to try and not move that around. But I do use that as a pointing tool, so I can't guarantee that I'm not going to use it entirely. But I'll try to not use it unnecessarily. So let me see here. Let's talk about some of the what Christmas looked like through several different time periods. And already we can see that feasting is a huge part of it. So let's talk about the Anglo-Saxons. And I'm going to start with them because we don't know really what the Romano-Celts did to celebrate Christmas. We don't even know if they celebrated Christmas. Because the early Christianity, there wasn't a succinct time or understanding of when Christ was actually born. Some say it was actually originally supposed to be March, and in Eastern Orthodox, they actually celebrate Christmas well into January. So, so we're going to start with the Anglo-Saxons. When we talk about the Anglo-Saxon period, we're talking about, again, the people that came up from the coast of Germany, Saxony and Friesland, and in that area there in Denmark. and there were several groups and tribes. All of them spoke an interchangeable language, and then all of them merged and eventually joined to form what would become the Kingdom of England later on. But originally they were different groups. So the Anglo-Saxons, they came over 500, a little bit, maybe a few decades before, but 500 AD, and they were finally conquered as a people in 1066. So I'll call this the Anglo-Saxon age. So the Anglo-Saxons, like I said, they were converted. And what was interesting about their way of taking up Christianity was that they saw in themselves the same kind of trials and tribulations of the Israelites. They really identified themselves with the Israelites, and so they took Christianity and really made it a very dour tradition. Upon conversion, they had a huge zeal as new Christians to the new tradition. Churches popped up everywhere. They had saints in almost every bedroom and every bathroom and every room in the house. There's a huge number of saints, usually royal saints. And so they really took Christianity not as the boisterous way that other traditions like Saturnalia was. They didn't see it as a time to feast. What they did, though, was see it as a time to put into practice Christian teachings. Almsgiving to the poor was huge. Fasting and vigils were also hugely important. And only later was feasting kind of crept in, and feasting became part of the scene. Originally, in the old pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon past, December 25th had significance to them, and they called it Modrenacht, which was Night of the Mothers in the month of Yule. And this was an important day for them, because a few days later there was this sense of their new year. At least that's my understanding. When they became Christian and Modrenacht was replaced, suddenly you had this idea of Christmas. And the very first use of the word Christmas in English comes from an Anglo-Saxon chronicle first recorded in 1034, and it looked like this: Christesmas. And that was the very, very first time that Christmas in our language appeared. And of course, feasting, as I said, became part of it later on, but that was because of French influence. For large portions of Anglo-Saxon history, there were periods where the ancient Norse and the Danes, especially the Danes from Denmark, well, the Danes from Denmark, from Denmark and Swedes and Norwegians dominated the country. There was the idea of the Dane law, and their traditions were supplanted onto, but of course then they also became Christian eventually too. And you get this beautiful scene on the Bayeux Tapestry. If you see here, this is the very famous scene where Godwinson takes Christmas, or spends time feasting at Christmas time, and you can see by then, you see the beautiful detail here, all the different types of food. Here, I'm going to move this over. I hope you can't see that. I'm just seeing that there's like a bar. I'm hoping that it doesn't show up later on, of it. You can't see that. You see all these different types of food here. I mean, just looking at them, you can really identify what they are. You've got breads, and you've got wine that they're drinking. Of course, the Anglo-Saxons loved wine too, imported from France. You've got fish there. And so this could be a feast that, even any of us would want to attend, right? But really, the people who made feasting great, especially at Christmas time, was the medieval people. So the Anglo-Saxons, the medieval age, we're looking at approximately 500 AD to about 1500 AD. So let's talk about them. Oh, there we go. But it was really the high medieval which was post-conquest, especially high medieval, as it imported from France, that really made Christmas huge in the popular imagination, and a lot of our traditions now descend from this period. So William the Conqueror comes up, 1066, takes over. Suddenly, there's a huge number of connections between the aristocracy, the new Norman aristocracy, and their homeland in Normandy. And then, of course, when the Angevin dynasty takes over, there's even more connections between France. And so you have then a very systematized way that the holiday evolves. You suddenly have multiple feast days devoted to multiple different individuals. And a lot of these, although we no longer practice them now in a secular sense, certainly Catholics in England and Scotland and Wales do now. Certain parts of these are also found in Anglicanism, but you certainly have a structure now to Christmas. So, we've all heard of these. I mean, these are still culturally understandable to us. So on the nearest Sunday to the feast of St. Andrew, and that was usually late into November, you would have the beginning of Advent. Advent actually doesn't start December 1st. It's always understood to be the nearest Sunday after the Feast of St. Andrew, which kind of shifts around due to the way of the year. Advent was actually proposed to be on December 1st by Advent calendar makers so that they could then, have their design set in stone. But you have this idea of the Advent fast. So for the weeks leading up to Christmas, you're fasting. And this has both a spiritual and a very practical sense. If you're planning on a huge feast later in the month, you're going to want to kind of preserve and save some of your stores. So while you're fasting for spiritual reasons, in preparation for welcoming Christ to the world, you're also saving that food that you're not eating that can then be contributed to the big feast afterwards, right? And in the medieval age, this was a hugely important time of year. Like I said, there were about 200 different feasts and celebrations in the Roman calendar, and in the Catholic calendar, even more. There's a huge number of different saints connected to the Catholic liturgy. And back then, of course, there were a huge number of saints that were decanonized in later centuries. So there were even more festivals and feasts and pilgrimages and all sorts of things. So we have the 12 days of Christmas, which began originally on December 25th. So the birthday of the feast of Christ, the birthday of Christ. The 12 days of Christmas, each one had a particular meaning. For example, some of them, the Feast of the Holy Innocents, which was December 28th. You had Candlemas, which was later in January. Candlemas was, I believe, January 4th or 5th. And that's when traditionally the idea was you bring your decorations down. And then, of course, January 5th, you had the Feast of the Three Kings. That's the three wise men who came over to welcome and give gifts to Christ. And then, of course, you had the Feast of the Epiphany on the 6th. What was important for this time of year was that everybody was expected to not work. I mean, certain chores needed to be done, but for the most part, work was cancelled, and it was 12 days of rest and feasting and jolly making and celebration, right? Masses were held all throughout this period for specific reasons. And even now, I mean, those of you who have attended midnight mass, that was part of this process. Beforehand, before this, the Anglo-Saxon Christmas had aspects of this, but what's important to see, all of this is an evolution. All of this became important, and of course in Catholicism there's this concept of tradition, right? So tradition is built, and tradition is divinely inspired. During the 12 days of Christmas, again, work was suspended. Visiting was encouraged. So going and seeing your family, going and seeing your friends was encouraged. And traditionally, pantomimes and mystery plays were performed. Is this starting to sound familiar? Very similar to what we do now. And we'll talk about pantomimes and mystery plays later on. Ironically and interestingly, this period was also seen as a time for kings to be crowned. So, you know, if an old monarch died, you know, the crown prince or whoever was taking on that role would not have his coronation until a certain set time. And there's quite a few kings who were crowned during this period. The huge figure of Charlemagne, Charles the Great in France, who of course founded or was crowned, I should say, the new emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, the new emperor of the Western Roman Empire. He was crowned on Christmas Day in, I believe it was sometime in the 800s, sometime in the 700s. I'm not too sure, but he was anointed on Christmas Day. And of course, the understanding with that is, what better time of the year than the birthday of the heavenly king to crown a temporal earthly king, right? There's no better time, no better auspicious, no better symbolic moment to do that. It was around this time that we also, of course, saw the decorating of the home with garlands of evergreen and winter foliage, bringing that in to decorate the home. Of course, that was the only foliage that was still green. Everything else was dead. Fall, of course, autumn had happened, and the landscape was looking quite bleak. And so bringing in that beautiful green foliage to decorate the home and decorate in inner spaces, churches, was a symbolic way of showing, again, the everlasting symbol of Christ. Of course, that being said, ancient pagan peoples had been doing that as well, and you know, there's something quite magical about plants that still remain green well into winter, right? Food was hugely important, and this is the time when we start to see something that we have hopefully in our cupboards right now. Mincemeat pies started to be created in this time. Originally back then it was mincemeat, that was the origin of the term mincemeat, but then over centuries and centuries that concoction was slowly changed from meat and eventually turned entirely into fruit and nuts. Fish and meats were normally unavailable because most animals also served dual purposes in this culture, and so you wouldn't just, you know, casually slaughter an animal that could give you eggs, or that you could use for plowing, or that you could use for riding, or that you could use for milking, right? And so really meat around this time was that piece of that necessity. And so gathering fish, having those meats prepared, and giving them some of that to the poor was highly recommended. And so it became a very festive time for that, because, you know, people suddenly had access to things that they wouldn't normally have had in their regular life. Okay. And so I just want to show you this beautiful image. This is from an illuminated manuscript. This shows a very typical Christmas feast. We have, of course, the king up here. We have the Christmas goose sat in front of him. Of course, turkeys back then weren't available. Turkeys came many centuries later, and are indigenous to North America. So the goose was kind of the important meat back then. But of course, you have others. You have fish. You have all sorts of different breads, and you see the sheer number of geese that are here. I know for a fact that certain individuals in the royal family enjoyed swan, and so swan was also used at these. At certain times, they would create beautiful sculptures of sugar, and which was almost impossible to get. Sugar was a very hot commodity and something that was very, very expensive. And so what would happen is you'd have these beautiful decorated sculptures made out of sugar. Spices, very expensive spices brought in from the Orient were used to flavor all sorts of dishes. This is also the time when you started to see things like puddings and things like that come out. Copious amounts of wine, copious amounts of ale were used, and of course celebration needed entertainment, and so you would also have mystery plays performed at these types of functions. You'd have jugglers, you'd have bards telling Christmas stories, you'd have all sorts of different things.
Ben?
Yes.
Somebody's asking, where are women at the feast? Were women not there, or are they just not in the
They're just not in this. They're just not in this picture. So this appears to be a feast because you can't even see a queen or a consort here. This appears just to be an all-male feast, but no, you would have had mixed crowds as well, especially at the upper echelons, and in the lower echelons of society, especially like homesteaders and local lords and squires and knights. You'd have had his whole retinue plus all of his retinue's families and important members there too. It would have been an insult to invite one of your knights and not his lady. Complete insult to do that. So yes, I appreciate that. Actually, I didn't even, to be honest, I didn't even notice that in this picture. Okay. Oh, there we are. Perfect. So we're going to skip over the Tudor age, because the Tudor age was very, very similar in many ways to the medieval ages that preceded it. Similar traditions, similar ways of utilizing Christmas and approaching Christmas. It was really in the early modern that we started to see a huge shift, and especially for the Reformation and Protestantism in the 1600s. We start to see periods where Christmas was almost, was outlawed. So during the early modern period, what we're talking about with that, we're talking about when Queen Elizabeth dies in 1602 or 1603. You suddenly had her second cousin from Scotland come down, James V and VI, and he became joint ruler of the Kingdom of Scotland and Kingdom of England. He then had his son, King Charles, of course, famously executed, the only Anglican saint that was canonized. And you then had a large group of dissident Protestant sects emerge to become powerful in the kingdom, and you had of course the Puritans and Civil War. And during the period of the Civil War, when the Puritans and Oliver Cromwell formed the Republic, Christmas was outlawed. Previous to this, there were still quite a few traditions that were not followed because they were considered popish. They were considered to be very anti-Christian in many ways because they came from Catholicism. You had, so various feast days connected with certain saints were abolished, and you had a general focus on Christ over feasting and jolly making, and we'll talk about a little bit more about that in when we talk about Father Christmas. Of course, you can't keep people down. You can't keep people from jolly making. You know, people love dancing, people love feasting, and people love singing. And so, upon the restitution of the monarchy, when the Merry Monarch came and took up the throne, you suddenly had Christmas traditions resumed. But it was tempered, it was changed, it was a little bit different from what it was before, and you still had certain puritanical ways of viewing Christmas time. And so if you're going down the street and you see a sign on the side of the road saying, "Keep Christ in Christmas," those were some of the same signs that you would have seen back in the kind of the post-Republic climate, the post-Commonwealth climate, I should say, not Republic. You would have had a lot more people who were looking at Christmas as a somber and Christ-centric tradition versus celebration. Of course, the Merry Monarch loved celebrating, and this is an image of him just completely enjoying himself during Christmas time. Okay. So how is that sitting with everybody? Is there any questions before we really launch into the Victorian?
No questions.
No questions, perfect. So let's talk about the Victorian, and there is no other time period that has so affected our view of Christmas than the Victorian period. There's an old wives' tale out there that the Victorians really invented Christmas. That isn't true. That isn't true. The Victorians didn't invent our modern Christmas, but they certainly introduced and popularized traditions that beforehand had been very regional or that were very low-key and not really part of the everyday culture. So this is one of the most famous images of Christmas. This is seen on multiple postcards, in newspapers, in everything. You've got these like little old ladies who were, anxiously looking at, reading books on the royal family back 150 years ago, 100 years ago. They would have seen images like this. This is propaganda. This is a fairy tale that was constructed by the royal family to show themselves as this loving, beautiful family. And no disrespect to Queen Victoria, but Queen Victoria did not like children. She had an innumerable number of them, but she did not actually like children. She very much loved her husband. Oh, she loved her husband, Albert, enough to the point where she had a plastic cast of his hand sleeping next to her well into her old age. But the image here, and why I say it's propaganda, is that it's showing a fantasy. And this is an interesting aspect of Victorian culture, is that, and something that if quite a few of the Brits in this chat right now will probably understand, British culture is all about showing ourselves a certain way to the public, keeping all of our hidden dark secrets in the back, right? We don't want to show those. And so the image here is showing a family-centric Christmas. A loving Christmas which was devoted to children, and at times Christmas was never a child's event, right? Gifts were not just given to children, gifts were given to everybody. But in this situation we have some central themes. We have the family, we have gifts being given and presented to children, we have toys, and then we of course had the Christmas tree. Now so let's just run down the list of some of the things that we enjoy now that were introduced or popularized by the Victorians, and particularly the royal family, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. So Christmas trees. Christmas trees did exist in England and other parts, well, mostly England, and before Queen Victoria came to the throne, but they weren't as massively popular as in Germany. And of course, the dynasty that made Queen Victoria, the Hanoverians, were a German dynasty. But this image alone popularized the Christmas tree, and suddenly it became a fad. Everybody wanted a Christmas tree. As soon as they saw this image printed of Queen Victoria celebrating her Christmas in her home with her family with a Christmas tree, suddenly you had everybody wanting Christmas trees. Christmas beforehand was a very it was a cultural event. You feasted with your community. You feasted and enjoyed it with the extended family. In the Victorian age, you shifted the focus so that it was mostly celebrated with the family, and then you went and saw other members of the family or friends after the fact. The Victorians were very, very well known for giving Christmas cards. Beforehand, in previous centuries, it was, nobody would even think of sending a Christmas card. A, because it was too expensive, and B, there was no real way of sending Christmas cards or mail delivery around the country unless you were very wealthy. But of course, then with steam engines and the ability for the Royal Mail to distribute letters all around the country very, very quickly, Christmas cards became very important. And there's a whole aspect of this I couldn't get into, but it was the bizarrity of Victorian Christmas cards. They were, some of them, if you even just Google Victorian Christmas cards, you'll start to see things like frogs, jousting or battling cockroaches, or really grotesque, weird things that have nothing to do with Christmas, at least on the offset. Gift giving at Christmas time became a much bigger thing. It was originally a New Year's tradition. So in England, at least, it was a tradition at New Year's when, and you can still see that piece in some of the regional traditions we'll talk about from Scotland and Wales about gift giving or giving candy or goods at New Year's and not Christmas time. The idea of the Christmas dinner of turkey, mincemeat, pies, and puddings really became encapsulated in the Victorian age, and specifically around some of the major cookbooks that came out that came out during this time. The Victorians were, they loved books, even more so than some of the previous generations before them, and they loved how-to books. There were tons of books detailing what a proper family should have in every possible social situation. If you've not seen it, and I'm going to suggest that most of you have heard of it, but if you haven't seen it, not Judith Goodman. Dr. Goodman, who is a historian from England, and she has an amazing TV shows. There's the Tudor Farm, there's the Victorian Farm, and she did one specifically around Christmas time called Victorian Farm Christmas, and she talks a great deal about food specifically and the Victorian kind of way of celebrating Christmas. So I'm pretty sure you can track it down on YouTube. If you can't, look it up. I think it's on BBC iPlayer somewhere. It's somewhere. Look it up. It's really, really interesting. And of course, turkey, that was, there's a very specific reason I've uncovered as to why turkey became the kind of a Christmas meal. Geese were very large, they're very big birds, and so generally speaking, especially for people who don't have access to freezing technology or refrigeration technology that we have, they would have had ice boxes, they would have had cold boxes, but a goose is too much. And for families that were starting to become smaller and smaller, and if you weren't feasting with large groups of people, if it was just your family, turkey is actually just the right amount of food for a family of, in this case, 6 or 7 or 8 people. It's just enough food. If you have a goose, you may have some left over and it just won't preserve, and so it'll go to waste. And of course, in the Victorian age, waste was shameful. I love the Victorians. They're such as ancestors, I can see how the Victorian mindset has really shaped modern England and Britain in general, but they were so peculiar. They were so quirky. They really were. But anyways, let's move on from the Victorians a bit. The other big piece around this was caroling. Caroling was important throughout the history of Christmas. At certain times, singing was seen as like taboo or low class or not something you should do. But caroling, especially outside of the churches, was really taken up by the Victorians because it was an outward showing of joy. being able to outwardly sing some beautiful Christmas carols, especially on the street. There's that like Dickensian image of the Victorian Christmas choir standing on a street corner, and the light post is just above them. The snow is just gently falling, and they're just singing the joys of Christmas. There's something very romantic about that, and that appealed to the Victorian character, right? So let me see. There's other pieces to this we'll get to later on, especially around food. But for right now, let's talk about some of the specific spirits of winter and Christmas that kind of pop up and become and populate the folkloric and story mindset of Christmas. How's everyone doing? Are there any questions so far?
No questions, but it's Ruth Goodman, and Victorian Farm Christmas is available on YouTube. I just looked.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Thank you. Yes, Ruth Goodman. I don't know where I got Judith from. Ruth Goodman. And they also did a Tudor Christmas too. They did a previous season, meant like 20 years ago, which showed a Tudor Christmas. So thank you for that. That's awesome. I'm going to be rewatching that this year, I think. So if you can see here, this image just in the back here, this image shows in the middle, he's not recognizable, but he actually is Father Christmas. And he's saying to this person, "Sir, I bring good cheer." And this Puritan is saying, "Keep out, you come not here." And this gentleman is saying, "Old Christmas welcome, do not fear." And this woodcut is from the 1600s and kind of shows that kind of cultural shifting between, you know, people who despised Christmas as a vain and foolish endeavor and not related to Christianity whatsoever. And then, of course, all of us who wanted to feast and dance and sing and celebrate. So let's oh, there we go. Let's talk about Father Christmas. Now, an important thing here, Father Christmas is not the same as Santa Claus, traditionally. I know that comes as probably a shock to a lot of people because in our modern culture, Santa Claus and Father Christmas are just two names for the same spirit, right? And I remember, I mean, when I moved over to Canada, you know, I was so used to calling him Father Christmas, and then being in Canada, of course, it goes the American style, we call him Santa Claus. But originally, Father Christmas evolved as a separate character to Santa Claus. He may or may not have connections to pre-Christian figures, but he started to form or become known around the 1500s. So we're looking at the Tudor period here. Of course, the Tudors came to the throne in 1492. I believe 1492-ish. We give or take a few years, and then King Henry VIII, quite famously in 1511. And so Tudor England was already starting to move into the modern age, and so this idea of personification became a big thing. Around this time, also, of course, the printing press was invented. And so you suddenly had a lot of books being produced very quickly and very cheaply versus the old manuscripts. This here is an image from 1658, and this is an image of Father Christmas presiding over the festivities. And you see in that image some of the similarities to what we have now. You see the cape that has the fur lining. You have the white beard, and you have the little cap that almost could be a Father Christmas hat. He was originally formed as a personification of Christmas, and he evolved out of various different symbolic representations. And what was interesting for that culture at that time, you had kind of two areas of the year. On the one hand, you had the two aspects of this time of year. On the one hand, you had the feasting aspect. But before that, there had to be the fasting. So you had the period of Lent, and then you had the period of feasting. And so in many mystery plays and in many comedies, actually, because you know, around this time was also the time and the rise of people like William Shakespeare later in the century, but beforehand there were all sorts of different theatre companies and groups going around, and they were moving more into comedic styles. This was also around the same time when traditional puppet shows like Punch and Judy was starting to emerge from France and Italy into English culture. You see Father Christmas being kind of talked about in quite a few places as the herald for Christ's birth, encouraging all to toast and celebrate the newborn king. And so he was often talked about roaming through the city, roaming through the town, roaming through the village, proclaiming Christ's birth, and shouting for everybody to celebrate and toast the newborn king. Originally, Father Christmas was not linked with children, though. He was seen as the personification of the jolliness of the season. So, of course, now we're starting to see, you know, the jolly old Saint Nick. But he wasn't Saint Nick, he was Father Christmas. In the 1850s, when you saw a lot more cultural connection between the US and Britain, where you had a lot of cross-cultural communication and very quick communication again, you started to see the American Santa Claus that we'll talk about next and Father Christmas kind of come, and then suddenly they start to merge. So you see Father Christmas taking on the iconography of Santa Claus, and vice versa. Santa Claus also starts to take on some of the iconography of Father Christmas. Perhaps his most famous appearance, Father Christmas's most famous appearance, although he's not named as Father Christmas in this, is Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, which actually, A Christmas Carol, we'll talk about it when we talk about ghosts, A Christmas Carol did a huge number on the culture because it was the first major public piece of literature that really encapsulated all of the Victorian ideas of what Christmas should look like. And in the Victorian age, it was, well, you have to keep up with the neighbor. You have to appear to be like everybody else because that was akin to being to morality, right? You know, the whole shaming thing in British culture right now of, oh, you know, what will the neighbors think, really comes out of this. And if you weren't seen as, you know, keeping up with the Joneses in many ways, you were seen as a bit strange. You were also seen as maybe a little bit Catholic, which in this culture at that time was not seen as a good thing. And I don't say that to be anti-Catholic now, but you know that you're coming out and emerging out of a period in British history where Catholicism was very much still looked down on and seen with fear, and so, you know, within in British society and culture, really you had to be very similar to everybody else around you. And Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol really showcased all of the Christmas traditions that became very big in the culture later on. And so in Charles Dickens's The Christmas Carol, the ghost of Christmas present is Father Christmas, even though he's not named as such. Okay. So then let's talk about Santa Claus. Now, the jolly old Saint Nick that we know on the side there, you know, there's an old wives' tale again saying that Coca-Cola is the one who invented the modern image of Santa Claus. And although they did a lot with their publicity of that image, similar to how Charles Dickens's The Christmas Carol really showcased and redistributed kind of a vision of what Christmas should look like, the Coca-Cola commercial in I believe it was 1936, all of the imagery of Santa Claus, popularized and really made him what he looks like today to us. Even before that, Santa Claus was still seen as, wearing furs, almost took on what we have here, this image here. But sometimes it was green, sometimes it was red, sometimes he had a lot more holly in his hair or had greenery in his hair, decorated with greenery. But then, of course, Coca-Cola came along and took a very particular view of him, and then that became the standard image of Santa Claus. And this has become the standard image of Father Christmas now because of that merging and cross-cultural exchange. Santa Claus is based on Sinterklaas, which is the name in Denmark, not Denmark, in Holland and in certain parts of Germany. And all of them are ultimately based on the Christian Saint Nicholas of Bari, who was a noted gift giver. Saint Nicholas, famously written about by Frank Oz in his Life and Adventures of Santa Claus, which was completely not his life, but it's just, the popular way of seeing him. And so what happened then was the modern story that we have of Santa Claus merged with Father Christmas and just became Sinterklaas, Santa Claus, Father Christmas all became synonymous. So who is he? Who is this figure? Of course, we all know him. Many of us know him. I'm not going to say all of us know him because we may have people in this chat who are from different cultures. But I think around the world, this image and the story of Santa Claus is pretty well known. He's believed to live up in Norway somewhere or in the North Pole somewhere. He flies on epic journeys around the world in his sleigh pulled by flying reindeer. He gives gifts to good children and cold, naughty children. In certain cultures, he has helpers, and in other cultures, he just goes by himself, or he has elves that are helping him. And what's interesting is, and this is where the folklore aspect comes in, this story is taken up, and we all know Santa Claus exists because we tell our children that he exists, right? We all know Father Christmas exists because we tell our children this. And so what do we do as an offering to Father Christmas or Santa Claus? We offer him milk and cookies and lay that out. And it's always magical when, the children come down the next day and the milk and the cookies are eaten, right? Always a magical moment. But this speaks directly to why I find folklore so interesting. Because while we exist in a so-called rational worldview, we also exist culturally and individually within a worldview of magical thinking, where both things can be true. It depends on how you look at it, and that's where the world of archetypes and kind of the hero's journey and all those wonderful things, mythic quests, come into it. So it's a way of encoding and teaching children things that will in later life emerge as important. If you haven't seen it yet, Terry Pratchett, very notable British author who sadly has passed away a few years ago, he wrote a very famous series called Discworld, and one of his books, in his world, it's a joke world where it's a flat disc supported by 4 elephants sitting on the back of a turtle flying through space. In this world, he has a figure called Death, who is literally death. He is the immortal death that goes around and helps dead souls transition onto whatever afterlife they're going to. And they also have a figure called the Hogfather, who is, in his world, a version of Father Christmas, Santa Claus. And in one of the books, Death has to take on the role of the Hogfather because the Hogfather has disappeared. But the Hogfather is important because he is like the fairy, the tooth fairy, or other mythological creatures or figures. He's important for his symbolic meaning. And there's an exchange at the end where Death is asked, what would have happened if the Hogfather hadn't survived? And, would the sun still have rose? And Death replies, so he's asked, would the sun still have rose? And he said, no, a ball of hot flaming gas would have rose. And his point he's trying to make with that is that magical thinking and these beings that we see in folklore and mythology, they exist in order to teach us to think outside of the box and to see the world not in the purely rational, cold, but to see it imaginatively and to then open ourselves to imagination. Anyways, long story short, it's an amazing movie. It's a Christmas movie, and we may actually talk about it later on. But it's great. Track it down, and the BBC did a small series about it. I absolutely loved it. Okay, so let's talk about some of these other mythical, magical creatures that inhabit the landscape at Christmas time. Santa Claus, talking about Jack Frost. So we have this beautiful image over here of Jack Frost peeping in and one of his little imps. Jack Frost, although he's become very well known, but the location he originates from is not as well known. Jack Frost is actually originally from the West Country and region of Cornwall. He shares his name with several other folklore figures such as Jack the Giant Slayer, Jack O'Lantern, famous around Halloween, and Jack in the Green, several other Jack figures. Whether these are all the same Jack or if Jack is just a kind of a common name or epithet applied to figures in this region, I'm not sure. But it's interesting. So Jack becomes a personification of winter. He's said to be heard crackling around the countryside, looking for humans to torment or pranks to pull. He appears very famously in the Rupert stories, and I believe it was the Christmas kind of episode or comic where Jack Frost and Father Christmas kind of have a little battle. He's said to go around and decorate window panes with frost, and he also has a darker sense where he brings storms, and he can be quite malevolent in some ways. He is seen as either a mischievous youth or a grumpy old man, nothing in between. So he's either one or the other. He's either seen, and that in many ways embodies winter in many ways, doesn't it? You have the playfulness of winter where you can play and things are different, but it's quite comfortable and playful. But then you also have the tempestuous. You also have the dangerous, the violent, the potentially lethal version of winter as well, right? So going up to Scotland, the winter personification up there is the Cailleach, the Cailleach, sometimes also called the Cailleach Beara, which is winter storm. She's the personification of winter in Scotland and Ireland. She's seen as a giantess who roams around the Highlands with a giant hammer and who keeps the Maiden of Spring as her prisoner. She's a magical being. She has magic, and with her powers, she draws from the natural world, but she also creates the natural world as well. Many places in Scotland, especially in the Highlands, if you go up there, you'll have, at least folklorically, it'll be understood that, this giant glacial boulder that was left here because of the glacier was actually a stone that fell out of Callie's apron as she was moving across the country. There's entire lakes or lochs that are blamed on Callie being there because she opened up a spring and forgot to put the spring stopper back, and it flooded the valley. She's the reason, or she's understood to be the reason, so many natural features exist, but also she is the reason that the winter storms happen. So just in autumn, the storms that brew up, the very violent storms and wind is understood to be Callie. Very interesting figure. More broadly speaking, we have figures that we talk about a lot in nursery rhymes. I know I definitely saw these in nursery rhymes a lot, but also the understanding in around New Year's. So we have Old Father Time and Baby New Year. Old Father Time is the spirit of the ending of the year. This statue over here is from a park in, I believe it's Berkshire. I'd have to check to see, but this is what the classic image of Old Father Time is. He's got the scythe, he is winged, and he is old. He is said to be born as Baby New Year on the 1st of January. Throughout the year, as the year progresses, he gets older and older and older, eventually becoming Old Father Time, and then the new Baby New Year is born on when Old Father Time dies. Now, Old Father Time, the imagery here that we have, there's a reason for this. The scythe is a very potent symbol in folklore connected to death, that's widely understood, but also time. And if you look here, the statue is also bearing an hourglass. And so the idea with this is that time as a constant is taken up symbolically and metaphorically in almost like an angel form, but being of this world. And there's a lot of linkages there with Saturn and Kronos. Kronos is the ancient Greek version of Saturn, and Kronos was often viewed as, because Kron is the root of it is time. That's where our words chronic and chronological emerge from. And so you have this then connection with time and the hourglass, right? And the scythe, being a symbol of death, is also connected to the harvest, because the scythe is such an invaluable tool at harvest time. And so then after the harvest time, it then becomes a symbol of death, because the harvest is done, the scythe is what is left over. And we're entering into a period of death while winter happens, before the new world, before the world is reborn in the spring. And speaking of death, this might seem like a very strange one to include in a Christmas celebration, but it's this is Ankou is a spirit from, or a being in Breton folklore and mythology. The people of Brittany in France are actually related to the people of Cornwall. That whole region is a Celtic nation. It's Celtic speaking. Breton is very closely related to Cornish and Welsh. And the Bretons were actually originally a colony of Cornish Celtic speaking peoples who left just as the Anglo-Saxons were invading or coming in, and they went down and settled that region. And so their folklore is very, very closely similar to Cornish and Welsh. And so in both Wales and Cornwall, this figure did exist in a much greater extent, but now you can only find it in Breton mythology. And the idea with Ankou literally is death. That's the in Welsh, Angu is or Angau, I should say, is the word for death. And what happens is the last person to die in a year and be buried is understood to become Ankou. And he becomes the servant of death and the guardian of the cemetery in that place for the next year, before then giving up that title to the next person who dies. And so this connection again between the new year and death on a symbolic level makes total sense, right? You know, it's coming to the end of the year, the last person to die is then going to be the guardian for the next year until the next person takes up that role, right? Doesn't make sense Christian-wise, doesn't make sense certainly rationally, but it's a way of, you kind of see this same logic. And that's the other thing about folklore is, when you understand the logic behind something, even if you don't necessarily agree with it, it becomes a lot more understandable. And so this then, this idea of, you know, death kind of lingering at the end of the year before the new year dawns and suddenly life starts to grow again, you see this in some of the other superstitions and customs in general. We'll talk about those in a few. Let me just check for time here. Okay. So those are some of the spirits that exist. And it's funny because, you know, you look at some of the other Christmas and New Year spirits around Europe. You get like a pantheon of different ideas or ways of taking up Christmas. Krampus is an example from down in Germany. You have La Befana in Italy, and of course the very controversial Zwarte Piet, who Black Pete in the Netherlands, who helps Santa Claus in his work. Very interesting ways that, you know, these different cultures have kind of taken up and infused in each time Christmas with these figures. Okay, so we come to the last piece. Just stopping here. Any questions around what we just talked about?
No, nobody's brought any questions forward.
Cool, perfect. So let's talk about now modern holiday traditions. This one is one of my favorites, and I'm sure all the Brits in the audience will recognize this as a pantomime, and we'll talk about pantomimes very soon. And as we go through, I'll talk a little bit about where some of these come from. One of the
question, Ben, before we get started.
Yes, of course.
How does the Welsh horse-headed spirit fit in?
Well, let me tell you, Mari Lwyd is one that we will be talking about in at the very last slide. So we'll talk about that. We will. I suspect we have somebody from the Sisters of Avalon, maybe. Perhaps. Okay. So we will talk about Mari Lwyd later on, because that is also one of my favorite ones too. And we'll talk about the Hoppy Horse tradition. Before that, we will talk about the pantomime dame, because she is magnificent. And actually, you could think about Mari Lwyd as a pantomime dame in some ways, I think. I hope that's not disrespectful. Before that, let's talk about ghost stories. So we talked about death being connected with Christmas and New Year's. And it's over the past couple of years, this idea of Christmas ghost stories has really re-emerged into the public figure. We used to have, from the Victorian age, this is why the Victorians were so quirky. We have a huge tradition of telling ghost stories, not necessarily at Halloween, because Halloween wasn't really a big thing for Britain. Guy Fawkes Day was much more our tradition than it was like the American Halloween. But ghost stories at Christmas time was something that the Victorians loved. And the Victorians loved the macabre. They loved the idea of the Gothic horror. Really came out in the last decades of the 1700s and definitely into the Victorian age. And perhaps one of the most famous we can really look to is that classic tale of Scrooge being visited by three spirits, and of course the ghost of Jacob Marley, with a moral tale, because the Victorians were always about morality, right? They were always about being good people based on what we did, not necessarily what we believed. So let's talk a little bit about Christmas. Again, coming back to that point I made about understanding the logic of traditions and how they fit in and why they fit in, helps to understand them. So, and I apologize, my cat's just in the background. She has a lot to say about this too. So Christmas was a liminal time of the year. It was a time when, first of all, you fasted, and then you stopped working. And that was not really well known. Like that was not a reality for most of the year. You did not stop working just in order to feast and celebrate. So it was a time when everything just like stopped. There was also that idea of role reversal, and so for centuries and centuries, you know, in most of the cultures, we talked about the role reversal was, you know, the very tight hierarchies that exist throughout the rest of the year didn't exist either. And so Christmas time was one of those times of the year again where everything was topsy-turvy. And the understanding of the spirit world in these different cultures was that when you entered into times when there was liminal space or liminal time, the connection between the realm of the death and the realm of the living came closer. And so these cross connections were possible. You also have to see it from a practical point of view of the nights were becoming longer and darker and certainly colder. And so you would have families who were spending a lot more time together, and you know, certainly you know, people spending a lot more time in pubs and taverns, basically just trying to stay warm, right? And there was also nothing left to do. The harvest was done. There wasn't anything left to do in tending the fields. And so it was a time where people finally had time to just sit and relax and talk. And so what is one thing that usually happens around campfires is that people tell ghost stories. From that, then, when we start to emerge into kind of the novel culture of the Victorians, where novels were really a big thing, and the late 1700s, then you started to see this same idea of you know, ghost stories being shared and interesting ghost stories being shared, turning into novels. And so then we have things like A Christmas Carol, and and then later on you have M.R. James and his ghost stories in the little pamphlets. Very famously, the BBC did a whole series with Christopher Lee back in the 1970s called a ghost story at Christmas with Christopher Lee, and I think you can find those on YouTube as well. So you had an interest then with ghosts and macabre tales and stories of the devil being talked about again around Christmas time. And it makes total sense when you see it from that understanding of they didn't have anything to do except feast and enjoy themselves. And the atmosphere was becoming cold, things were dying around them or going into slumber, and the time was very liminal. There's been a concerted effort over the past couple of years to really revive this interest in ghost stories, and I, for one, am ready for it. I love ghost stories, but it also makes sense in a different way too, because the Victorians were a very repressed people. They were very interested in order and everything in its place and everything with a place, but at the same time, they were also very fascinated with things like murder stories. Sherlock Holmes comes out of this too. You know, it was almost like modern Japanese culture, where on the one hand you have this very orderly, precise, prim and proper society, and then underneath you have all of these other things that just doesn't seem to like it's contradicting the main narrative, and yet it's all part of that culture, right? Let's talk about pantomime. So this pantomimes, if ghost stories were an expression of the kind of the macabre and the repressed nature of the culture, pantomime is the same thing but in a different way. Pantomime is is showing the same thing but in a different way. So what are pantomimes? Now, I'm going to guess that we have a lot of Brits in here, but I also know that we have a lot of people who are not from Britain or with a British background. So what is a pantomime? So a pantomime is a very particular form of stage play. It's actually got a very long history, although we wouldn't necessarily know it. It's tied now very specifically to the holiday season, and one of the joys of being a young child and an older adult in Britain is to go and see a pantomime on stage. The very first pantomime I ever saw was at Bottlewood Castle in North Wales. And it was Aladdin, and it was hilarious. and I loved it. And every year I watch some on YouTube. You can actually find full length features on YouTube. So the roots of the pantomime, it actually goes back to Renaissance Italy, and it's a comedy form of roaming stage performers called the Commedia dell'arte. And these groups would go from village to village, town to town, and they would put on stage plays. And it was similar to the roots of Punch and Judy shows. So those of you who don't know what Punch and Judy is a traditional puppet show, again using very specific stock characters, very particular storylines that could be rehashed based on what the audience. So it's a particular style of storytelling using specific types of puppets, whereas the pantomime is similar in that it uses primary elements, stock characters. There's slapstick comedy. Double entendre is huge. And if we look at the pantomime dame down here, you can see the double entendre going on with the flower pots on there. There's a lot of repeated phrases in pantomime, just like in Punch and Judy. Some of those repeated phrases are things like, "Oh no, you didn't. Oh no, you didn't," or "Don't look behind you. Don't look behind you," or "It's behind you now." All these different stock phrases that, you know, when you're in the culture and you're watching these shows, you see again and again and again. And they become funny because they're part of the in-joke, right? And breaking the fourth wall is always a thing with pantomimes. You know, as audience members, you're watching the show, and then suddenly you become part of the show because the characters will look at you and say, "What do you think? What do you think? What do you think?" Some of the stock characters that are always in a pantomime, and pantomime. So pantomime stories are, nowadays, anyways, they are fairy tales. So The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Jack and the Beanstalk, all sorts of different folklore tales like those. But then they're rehashed, and the humor is, of course, very up to date. The modern kind of way of pantomimes goes back about 100 years. But then before that, there were shows and there were plays being performed that kind of were pantomimes. So the modern way of pantomimes, you have a principal boy, you have a principal girl, usually very loved in interest. You have the pantomime dame, which is normally the mother or the stepmother of the principal boy or the principal girl. Sometimes the wet nurse, sometimes like the queen. And the pantomime dame is always played by a man. So this is an interesting kind of throwback to Shakespearean times, when in in Tudor culture and early modern culture, it was not seen as appropriate for women to be stage actresses. It was only appropriate for men to be, and so men would often take the female roles. This also, of course, connects with drag and the tradition of drag shows. So the pantomime dame, she is usually long-suffering. She is usually in control totally of her life until she isn't. And she always has very bizarre names like Madame Twanky or Hanky Panky or something like that, right? You have the principal villain, which is in every sense of the word the archetype of the villain. So, you know, it'll be the evil king or the evil priest or the evil like Jafar or the vizier or something like that. You'll have the double act, which are usually the sidekicks of the principal villain. And the double act are two characters that work off of each other and create kind of like a side story within the bigger story. And they're usually just there for comedic effect. They're always there just to add extra laughter to the environment. You have the immortals. So for example, the fairy godmothers, or in the case of like Aladdin, you would have the genie. So they're the magical kind of assistants or individuals who help the principal boy or the principal girl in their quest. And then you have the pantomime animal. Now, the pantomime animal, and I'm glad somebody raised the point of Marie-Louise, the horse-head skull. The pantomime animal is a new version, or the pantomime version, of the hobby horse. And the hobby horse is a tradition that you find in multiple parts of the UK, and not so much in Ireland, but definitely in England and Wales. And it's a tradition where you would have some kind of like an effigy of an animal, or a person who is taking on the role of an animal, going around dressed up as an animal, and it's like trick-or-treating. They go door to door to door, and they do whatever that regional specific thing is. The pantomime animal is a version of that, and usually it's two people who are dressed up as a ridiculous version of a horse or of a camel, or some ridiculous creature that needs to be part of this story, but they add comedic effect. So like they'll come out and it's like, or like in Jack and the Beanstalk, for example, it'll be a cow, but like it'll just walk, it'll be ridiculous, it'll be silly, and sometimes it'll come apart and then come back together again. Really, it's just about laughs, right? But those are the principal things that you will, those are the stock characters you will always find in the Great British Pantomime. And what's important about pantomimes folklorically is that they are just another version and another way of presenting the stories that in past folklore would have been very, very important locally. So Jack and the Beanstalk, for example, we look at it as fairy tale. Fairy tales are usually not connected with any particular place. They're stories that are just shared throughout different cultures, and the adventure could be happening like in the next door. It could be anywhere. It's not usually located, and it's not usually connected to any particular time or place. But most fairy tales did originally come from specific places. And so pantomimes are just another way of showcasing the stories that we've all grown up with and that have been present in the culture for generations upon generations. Excuse me. So coming out of the pantomime, let's talk about something that we see every single Christmas time on British television, and that is the various Christmas specials. And what's interesting is when you look at these through the lens of a pantomime or through those stock characters, you can see then how the folklore of Christmas and the stories of Christmas are taken up and placed into the whatever TV show or radio show that is taking it up. So it's a very unique aspect of British television. It started to then spread out into other cultures. And so now you see a lot of American shows, or quite a few American shows that have Christmas specials. But in England and Wales and Scotland, it's almost expected that there'll be a Christmas show. And people get very disappointed when there's not a Christmas show. One of my favorites, Gavin and Stacey, beautiful little love story, famously came back again after a 10-year hiatus last Christmas, and there was a special Christmas episode from that. So in many ways, it's a way for these television shows and radio shows to keep coming back again and again with Christmas specials. They're either standalone or they tie in with the narrative, and usually they involve the characters of that show somehow having to deal with Christmas in some way or New Year's in some way. So sometimes it doesn't even necessarily make sense to the rest of it, but it's all part of kind of retelling the older stories in a different format in a new way. So like on the side here, a few years ago when Matt Smith was playing Doctor Who, the 11th Doctor, there was a Christmas episode that was very Dickensian and based on a planet which looked like Victorian London, and the Doctor had to save the day and took that up. A lot of sitcoms will take up the kind of the celebrating Christmas or having to deal with Christmas in a different way. Or in some TV shows like Doctor Who especially, you'll have Father Christmas suddenly come and there's no explanation why, and it's they're interacting with these characters. So again, it's a way of enlivening the Christmas stories, but in a different way, and then kind of merging multiple different realities together again. And I love it. I love it. I'm looking forward to the Mrs. Brown's Christmas episode. I believe there's one this year, and if not, I will be very, very upset. So let's talk. So coming out of this again, let's talk about the nativity. So we have, we've talked a lot about different, we've talked about pantomime, we've talked about different stories that are not related to Christ in any way. But the Christ is still part of Christmas, right? And the nativity is just another version that our culture uses story and uses storytelling as a way to enliven the season, and that is the nativity story. In many communities, just like pantomimes, the nativity is kind of another sphere of celebration. I know when I was in the UK, when I was still over there and I was attending primary school, we were all of the kids would take part in the nativity at school, and you see down here this group of school kids, each playing the role. You have like, and just looking at it from a cultural place, just looking at it, we know exactly who these characters are. You've got the three kings in the background here, these three kings of the Magi. And what do they wear? They're wearing crowns. We know that. You've got Mary and you've got Joseph and you've got the little baby. And we know it's Mary because she's got the baby and she's wearing blue. Mary always wears blue, right? You've got all of the shepherds, you've got sheep, angels. And so then the nativity becomes a very understandable and readable. Even just looking at it, we can read the story because we know the story so well, right? But the nativity becomes just a part of the celebrations. We already know the story, and chances are these kids are not going to remember their lines, but that's all part of the fun. Now, talking about Christmas specials, one of the kind of the cherished pieces of the folklore around the nativity specifically, and telling the nativity story, is how in some Christmas specials or movies, the trying to do the nativity, but majorly making it wrong, right? Just messing it up completely. One example is in quite a few British comedies, especially in the 90s, the Christmas special was the trying to put on the nativity and just messing up, and it's not working, and it just isn't going well, right? A movie that I really love is, and it's a dated movie now, but it's got some of the best of the British actors at the moment, and that's the Flint Street Nativity. And it's all of the actors are playing kids. They're playing younger versions of themselves and their parents, and they're just taking up all the different tropes, and it's kind of set in the background as the show is going on. This is in the classroom just behind as the kids are waiting to go on in and perform. And so the whole movie is just based around kind of how kids are reacting to being on stage and all of that. But it's interesting because, again, we can read it, right? We know who all of the characters they're supposed to be playing are. And so the comedy is in them trying to figure out how to do it, right? It's wonderful, a really beautiful Christmas story. But if you look at any of the British comedies on, usually at least one of them is going to be dealing with, the nativity and not getting it right? Okay, so we're gonna turn away from, we've talked a lot about entertainment, the pantomime, the Christmas specials, the nativity. Now let's talk about an aspect of the holiday that is always steeped in history and culture, and that is the food. If you're British, looking at these images here, you can probably identify every single one of them, right? We've got the Christmas pudding, the traditional Christmas pudding with the sprig of holly on it. You've got the mince pie. You've got the famous fruit cake. And I'm sure all of us have stories about our grandparents or gran and her famous fruit cake, or buying a fruit cake and trying to pass it off as her own. So what we eat is very indicative of who we are and what our culture is. And there's a lot of very interesting folklore around even just the food that we eat, customs and traditions and superstitions around. So, for example, one of them is placing a silver sovereign or a crown, which is an older version of an old form of UK money, into the Christmas pudding, and whoever finds it in their piece will be very lucky, right? So when we think about our food, think about it not just as stuff that we eat, but as part of the pageantry of the holiday season. It's part of the proper ritual of the holiday season, whether or not we're aware of it or not. And you know, these are some of the things that, you know, it's almost like the stock. Kind of the stock character of Christmas dinner. And what's interesting is when you look at how television has affected our way of cooking, and the Victorian age affected our way of cooking. You know, beforehand it was whatever you happen to have. Now it's you have to have this, 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 and this, and this in order to be proper. So we see folklore in a different way. We see it dictating our social rituals, and the folklore is now being generated by, you know, writers 150 years ago who were showcasing these. So, you know, this is not just Christmas dinner. This is Christmas dinner as it was being put out by Ebenezer Scrooge and his family, right? This is the Christmas dinner of family. This is the Christmas dinner that is going to wow everybody. And what's interesting is if you look at how food shows such as Fanny Craddock, monstrous Fanny Craddock, love her, I love Fanny Craddock, but you know, she really put out this image of what Christmas should look like. Then of course you have Delia Smith, you have Nigella Lawson, you have all of these cooking shows that are presenting you an image, a fantasy version of what your Christmas could look like. And I remember very, very fondly, there's an episode of The Royal Family, which is a British sitcom from the 90s. And they were talking about how they were trying to cook Nigella's perfect Christmas dinner. And it was all messing up. Everything was going wrong. It didn't look anything like what was on the screen, and everybody was miserable because of it. Because in many ways, you know, another aspect of the British Christmas is to be miserable with each other, right? But it is fascinating to see even just how food is. You know, if we go back into the medieval age and we go back into the Anglo-Saxon age and we look at the images of what was on their tables, we didn't see any of this. You know, we saw the mince pies, but we didn't see Yorkshire puddings. We didn't see the veg. We certainly didn't see cranberry sauce or turkey. So this is an example of how the holiday has evolved as our culture has evolved. And, you know, to us, well, this is proper. This is what a Christmas dinner should look like, right? So it's interesting, and folklore in many ways is the same way. That's how this is connected with folklore, because in many of the stories that we tell ourselves that, you know, is folklore in emergence, this will be the classic image that we will have. I also put this up because I'm looking forward to what my own parents will be putting out on the table. And they're at the age now where they're not going to be putting any of this out because they can't be bothered anymore. So this is more for me to get ready and, you know, look forward to something that's not going to happen. So let's then focus on some of the common customs and beliefs. So let's talk a little bit about that for Christmas. And some of these are things that, if you're British or you come from a North American background, you may see these because these are cross-culturally shared. So, for example, in some parts, snow on Christmas means that Easter is going to be green. It is bad luck not to kiss someone under the mistletoe. So, of course, the tradition, you put a sprig of mistletoe up and you have to kiss whoever's under it. in some parts, especially in Scotland, I know for sure, and in certain parts of Wales, you have to finish all your knitting before New Year's Day, or else it's considered bad luck. And in some cases, it's actually considered to be quite inappropriate to continue knitting something that you started the previous year. Particular Anglican one, and I believe also Catholic, but I know this is definitely an Anglican one. If you take a candle to church, you should leave it there. Don't bring it home. Give it to the vicar for good luck. And I did a little bit of digging on this, and there's a reason for this. Because originally Catholics would take candles to church, especially during the medieval age, in order to bless them because of the symbol of Christ being the light of the world. So you take your candles that you've made at home or wherever you've gotten them from, and you would get them blessed in the church, and then you bring them home. And so lighting them at home, you would get the kind of the church's blessing in your home. This is an example of kind of the anti-Catholic rhetoric that kind of just became big and then kind of subsumed into the culture to kind of just become a little superstition, you know, here and there. Don't bring candles back because that's what Catholics did. Leave them in the church because the church is it needs them, and that's also a slight comedic point about how church, the Anglican Church, is always looking for money. Anyway, sorry, moving on. On New Year's Day, it's considered bad luck if the first visitor at your house has red hair. This is a very old medieval way of looking at the world, is that red-headed folk are not lucky. The best luck comes from a knock at the front door by a man you don't know with black hair. It's also considered very bad luck to knock on the back door. Always knock on the front door. And this is actually something I remember doing as a kid. So I remember, so we were living in North Wales. We were living in this tiny little cottage in the middle of nowhere, about an hour in from the English border. And I remember several New Year's Eve where my dad would take us all, and we were all like 4, 5, and 6 at the time, and he would take us out the back door, and we would run around to the front door, and just as the clock chimed 12, we would all knock on the door, and we would all go in, and that was it was something we didn't do over in Canada here, but certainly something we did back home. The man with the black hair, still not sure where that came from, but this is customs and superstitions and beliefs. There is logic behind it, I'm sure. It's just probably a historical footnote, and it's lost to time. The take down all your decorations on January 5th. If you don't take your decorations down, it's considered unlucky. That actually is a historical reason. It's because you were expected back at work in 2 days' time. And so if you didn't take down your decorations, of which there will be ample, you wouldn't have time to do it. So it was a take them all down because then you'd have time, you wouldn't have to worry about them later on. So again, like with these beliefs and customs, there were reasons for them. And now, after so many centuries, we just see it as good luck. Whereas originally there was an actual practical reason for it too. Okay. So let's talk about regional traditions. Regional traditions, these are all traditions that are localized to specific places. They are so there's every single region of the UK and Ireland have their traditions. It's the essence of folklore to be regional versus kind of international. I've handpicked 4 different ones to show, because I mean we would be here for hours if I spoke about all the ones I'm interested in. But you'll kind of see then the flavor, the local flavor. So let's talk about caroling. Caroling is a big thing. You see carolers all over the place. Another thing that Charles Dickens did with his Christmas Carol, he really popularized the idea of caroling. He really popularized the idea of that image of carolers singing cheerily in the in the night on the street side, you know, creating and sharing Christmas cheer. And it's such a fantasy because, as we know, London at the time he was writing was filled with smog, was huge misery in the country, and the Industrial Revolution was creating havoc and nightmares. But still, this image of, you know, of the stout and strong British showing of joy in the Christmas season was huge, right? So caroling at certain times of the over the past, you know, 1,000 years, singing was seen as bad, uncouth, something you shouldn't be doing. It was a show of vanity. At other times, it was an expression of joy, and certainly in the past 200 years, the churches really flip-flopped on whether or not it was appropriate to sing in a church or not singing in church. Now, of course, we you know, if you go into a church, one of the presiding images of the church is singing the carols and singing. But this is an interesting, there are two things I'd like to really talk about here to showcase kind of this, this relationship between Christmas and caroling. In Wales, there's a specific form of morning caroling called plygain. And plygain roughly translates to 3-point harmony. And what's interesting here is that it was the timing of plygain. So you'd have groups of plygain singers traveling around over 6 weeks. So that it would actually start in late November, early December, and it would go for 6 weeks. And you'd have groups of plygain singers going around. It exists now only in mid Wales, but it's starting to grow. And it actually was originally found throughout Wales. Pardon me. So you would have, so plygain caroling is where there are 3 notes being sung. And so you have these 3 harmonies that are interweaving. It's beautiful. Look it up on YouTube. It's very, very, very nice to hear. Of course, they would be singing in Welsh, who wouldn't be singing in English. And what was amazing was that plygain caroling would start at 3 a.m. in the morning and run until 6 a.m. And then at certain times it would be expanded to go right till 12. And it was always in the church. Nowadays it's all over the place, but it's a very church-based tradition. So you'd have, the church was packed with people and carolers, and they were just belting this out. Conversely, in England, in Yorkshire, 200 years ago, churches did not allow their parishioners to sing carols in the church, but because singing is such a massive part of English, Irish, Scottish, and Welsh culture, where would you go singing? Well, you went to the pub. So this tradition is in Dunningworth in Yorkshire. And it starts the first Sunday after Armistice Day, and it's a pub-based tradition. So 200 years ago, they were kicked out of the church. They went to the pub, and now the pubs are the places where people congregate to sing carols. So it's like plygain, but it's based in the pubs. And folk songs, traditional carols, and cheeky melodies are all sung. What's amazing with this tradition is that it has spread out into some of the local villages and towns close to Dunningworth, and people even come back from as far away as New Zealand. When I was reading into it, people come back as far as New Zealand, Canada, and US to go back to Dunningworth to enjoy singing these carols. So you've got in this 2 examples of kind of how the church both loved and hated caroling, and yet people were irascible. People still sung, and I just love that, gathering together in a pub. You know, if Dunningworth was closer to Wales, I'm sure you'd like start singing in the church at 3 a.m., go till 6 a.m., go to the pub afterwards, drink a little bit, sing some more, come back. You know, I could see the whole day being filled with song. Okay. Let's talk about Hogmanay. If you're up in Scotland during New Year's, you'll hear about Hogmanay. Hogmanay is the kind of the general term, and it appears and manifests in various different ways throughout Scotland. You know, depending upon the region, you might have street parades showcasing local culture, or like almost like a Mardi Gras for those North Americans. Gift giving offerings and offering gifts to the first people through your front door are important. So whereas Christmas time is, you know, where you majorly give gifts, there's also this tradition. And one of the reasons why this exists and why it's such a nighttime thing, it's almost like trick-or-treating, but you're expecting like good people to come through your door. And you offer those gifts to whoever comes to your door first. In some places, you get parades of torches through the street. So if you can see in the background here, you might not be able to see it, but you see almost like a Viking here. So up in Orkney and those parts of northern Scotland which have a strong Norse cultural background, you have people running through the streets, and it's almost like it's a parade. They've got torches and they're dressed up as Vikings. In some parts of the Highlands, you also have the tradition called signing, which is a ritual blessing of the home using what's called magic water. And that is water gathered from a dead creek and a living creek. So like a dead stream or a stream that's no longer flowing and a stream that is flowing. You mix that together and you suddenly have this magic water that then you flick around your house. Now, of course, looking at the religious history of Scotland, we know that in the Highlands, it was a very strong Catholic holdout, and then it became a very strong Knox Presbyterian holdout, and so in many ways this could be seen as the older tradition of going to the church, gathering holy water and bringing it back to your house to bless your house. But they're going to the natural landscape and collecting. And there also may be pre-Christian connection to this. But that's Hogmanay. The New Year's, or the old New Year's tradition in Wales was something called Calennig. And Calennig was very similar to trick-or-treating. You would have young children go door to door on New Year's Day, and in some areas the children would hold apples. You can see that just being held here. The kid is holding an apple that has little sticks or little skewers that are forming a tripod, and they would go around and ask for little treats of bread or cheese or little treats. And they would say in Welsh, unfortunately, I'm still learning Welsh, so I didn't feel comfortable saying it in Welsh, but the translation of what they would say, depending on the region, was, "Today is the start of the new year, and I have come to you to ask for coins or a crust and bread and cheese. Oh, come to the door cheerfully without changing your appearance." So they expect people to come to the door without like getting dressed. This was very early morning. And then they say, "Before the next arrival of the new year, many will be dead." So in many of the Celtic countries, you can see this connection between the new year and death, and this idea of death always being present. And I think that speaks a great deal to kind of the cultural essence of the Celtic countries and the connection points between them all, and the distinction between English culture, the various English cultures, and the various Celtic cultures is that you see death appearing, and that understanding of death appearing in the celebration of life, right? And certainly in Celtic Christianity, you've got the connection there between Christ being born, and then of course at Easter time, in only 4 months, you're going to be celebrating his death or mourning his death, right? So you've got that interesting overlay there. Now, as somebody asked before, let's talk about Mari Lwyd. So Mari Lwyd is a Christmas celebration in Wales. So you can see here, what we have here is a hobby horse. So there are other traditions around England that is similar to Mari Lwyd, But what you basically have here is it's a horse's skull set onto a pole. A person is underneath this blanket here, or this covering here, holding it up, holding the skull up. And in some cases, you actually have the ability to move the bottom jaw so that it looks like it's like the skull is talking. And so it originally was found in South Wales. It's now throughout Wales. It's been taken up by neo-paganism, but it's also used culturally. And you actually, in Chepstow in Wales, they have an annual gathering of all the various Maoris that come. There's some debate still as to what Mari Lwyd means. Some say that it's the grey mare, in which case that explains the white and the white shawl, the white covering, and of course the horse's head. But it also could have a connection to Mary too, which would make sense for Christmas being Mary, being the mother of Jesus Christ. So what happens with this tradition? Mari Lwyd goes door to door, and in Welsh, of course, shouts out into the houses challenges in poetic form. And the idea is that you're trying to engage in a lyric battle with the inhabitants. The inhabitants have to defend themselves by rhyming pieces of poetry back to you, and then it's just a wearing out. If Mari Lwyd and the revelers are able to outmatch the occupants have to relent and let Mari Lwyd and the revelers come into the home, in which case they're given alcohol and treats and food and drink. Really fascinating tradition. Now, I should mention, especially for those of you who are connected to OBOD and the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, this tradition may look like it's pre-Christian. It may seem like it's pre-Christian. It may very well have pre-Christian connections. But what's written about it has only emerged within the Christian period. And it's certainly taken up within a Christian context and by Christian revelers. In neo-paganism, of course, it's been taken up quite famously by the Anglesey Druid Order. That's Christopher Hughes and his group up in Anglesey. And my understanding of their tradition is that they've linked Mari Lwyd, the horse's head, with the Celtic figure from the Mabinogion, the very, very famous set of Welsh tales, and the figure of Rhiannon, the otherworldly rider, the figure from the otherworld fairy lady from that appears and is one of the love interests and is taken up as a goddess in those traditions. And so if you go onto their Facebook page, they actually explain a lot more about how they've taken up this this tradition in a modern neo-pagan way. And I know Chris is very adamant of naming that and saying this is a modern neo-pagan way of seeing this tradition, and this is what we have done with this tradition. So that gives you an example then of how folklore has been taken up by different groups in different ways and formed based on the need of the now. And that's the other thing I really want to put out there for those of you who are part of the folklore community, is that folklore is adaptive. It changes based on where it is located to become relevant to that group of people. And as we've seen throughout this entire presentation, Christmas has done that. It has become different things at different times for the people based on their needs. Sometimes Christ has come into the picture. Sometimes Christ is kind of out on the balcony looking around. Sometimes Christ is, surrounded by a whole plethora of different spirits, and none of them contradict each other. None of them contradict each other because they're all part of a different reason and need at this time, right? So I hope that answered the question for who was asking that before, but that is that is all I have for you on this. So I'm going to stop sharing and we're going to do a little bit more talking if there's any questions. So let me just go back to stop sharing. There we go. Okay, we're all back now. If you want to turn on your cameras, you're more than welcome to. And that's all I have for you. I'll add a few more notes. If you're interested in the other parts of this series, I have created a 13-part series on other aspects of British folklore and tradition. You can find that at my website, padukawellness.com, or just check out my YouTube page. If there are any other questions about this presentation, I'm here, and we can entertain them. And I've really looked forward to having you all here. Thank you so much. Okay. You're very welcome, Shannon. Oh.
Can you repeat your website again for me, please?
Absolutely, Alison. So I'll put it in the chat too. So it's padukawellness.com. Each of the presentations are $30 each. But the back recordings of the ones I've already done, I started them a few months ago, are available. I have them all on YouTube as private links, but if there's any of those you're interested in, I can take payment and then you can see them. And then just go to padukawellness.com. You can also find my YouTube page on there. And if you're coming from folklore researchers, Order of Bards, Ovates, or Druids, or British medieval folklore, British medieval history, I'm going to be posting this video on there later on too. So, perfect.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Oh, thank you, Stephanie. Oh, okay. Were there any other questions? You're welcome. You're welcome, Christina.
I've been sitting here winding juniper bundles for my shawning.
Oh.
I have lots, so if you'd like some.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome to them.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Well, if there aren't any other questions, then I will let everybody go. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of the night and Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas and thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. You're very welcome. Have a good night, everybody.
Take care.
All right.
Everyone.